Hello, everybody. Very excited to be giving this talk today on the seven deadly sins of DEI on integral life. So, just a little context for the talk today. There's a lot of information. I have quite a few slides that you'll be able to see if you're on the live call here on your computer. But if you're listening to this, I will explain the slides. So, no worries there. And, there's a lot of information here. And any one of these points could easily be gone into and really sort of be its own talk. And so by necessity to keep this thing under maybe 50 minutes or so, I am going to be skimming along a little bit through some of these details. I won't be able to take questions or read any chats until the end of the call, but when we get through the seventh one and I wrap up, happy to take some Q&A and sort of hear your thoughts or reflections or places where you have, challenges or anything like that. So looking forward to that part of the call. All right. So sit back, relax, enjoy the talk. And I would encourage everybody to have an open mind and bring your questions, bring your curiosity, bring your challenges. That's why I'm here. Talk about this subject in a really nuanced way, I hope. So to give some context, so I have been, just to out myself here, I have been sort of a card-carrying liberal my whole life, very on the progressive side. I voted for Clinton and Gore and Kerry and Obama and then Clinton again, and I will probably almost certainly vote for Biden. So I'm not at all pushing a conservative side on this. I do believe that racism and sexism exist and that they're problematic and that they do need to be systemically addressed. It's my view that ideas on this need to be kept fluid and open, and that we all really need to be willing to have a dialogue around these things and be, open to criticism, which, obviously includes me being open to criticism from you guys. So my own personal views are that all human beings are equally worthy of dignity and of being seen and treated as human beings. And, I fully concede that there are currently in 2023 problems with sexism and racism that exist and do need to be addressed. And so I want to make sure that, this doesn't come off as any sort of an anti-DEI talk, diversity, equity, and inclusion. I really want to acknowledge the places where I think it has things right, but then I want to be critical of the places where I think it has things wrong. And just a word sort of at the top to give sort of a meta view, this is integral life. And so anytime we talk about something like this that has this level of complexity, I would encourage everyone to keep in mind the idea of polarity. And so that a lot of these concepts really only make sense and exist in polarity to their opposites. So, for instance, justice and equity. Justice and equity are kind of two sides of a polarity. If we overemphasize justice, we can often lose the view of equity, really hardcore law and order can lose the nuance of a system that's maybe biased against a certain group of people. And if we have too much focus on equity, then we might lose a sense of justice. So, the Me Too movement, which, was a very historically necessary thing, I would argue that it began to go a little bit too far and lose sight of justice and things like due process and, the idea being that justice and equity need to be always in balance with each other. The same thing we could say, like, diversity. Diversity is great, right? But what's the polar opposite of diversity? Well, that would be homogeneity, if I can say it. And the idea being that while diversity is great and we want diversity like in our classrooms and in our boardrooms, we don't want it so diverse that we have neo-Nazis or KKK members in there. So there's always a play of these things that have to be kept in sort of a fluid and living balance. And so that's going to be the case through this whole thing. So I would encourage you to just sort of keep that in mind. Okay, so with that, we'll get into our first point. So the seven deadly sins of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So the first one, and I will recap these all at the end, so you don't have to keep notes or anything. The first one is an overly simplistic view of privilege. That's the first one. So I would define privilege as access to power, access to money, education, influence, work, or upward mobility. Okay, I think that's a decent definition of what privilege is. And, we live in a world, in the DEI world, where there's this charge that minorities and women have historically been disenfranchised from privilege. And I think that's inarguable. I think there's an overwhelming tidal wave of evidence to show the proof of that. And then the question, of course, is how much is that still going on today? To what degree? And what do we have to do about it? What should we do about it? Right? That's where the sort of the meat of the talk is. So I would argue, though, that while DEI focuses on race and gender, it ignores three fundamental things that are actually equally important when we look at the economic and social data. And those three things are class or economic status, level of education, and your family of origin, how many parents you have, and what socioeconomic status you grow up in. So those three things, class, education, family of origin, I'm going to argue in this first point that they are equally, if not more important than race and gender in 2023. And before I get into that argument, I want to again pause and make a meta note here that that's 5 places of privilege that I'm talking about. But we really could extend the concept of privilege in many, many places. There's body type, there's intelligence, there's cultural attractiveness, which is a huge benefit in the culture in which you live. There's kinesthetic ability, right? If I have innate kinesthetic ability, that might not help me on Wall Street, but it is going to help me in the NFL. There's the big 5 personality traits, which really there's a lot of data that they show that can help define what makes people successful in places like the West and America. But those same things that make you successful in the West would be a detriment if those were your top personality traits in a place like Japan. So privilege is a big conversation. It's culturally dependent. It's context dependent. Okay. So, but with that in mind, let's get into my first critique that DEI focuses too much on race and gender and not enough on class, family of origin, and education. So class is obvious. I don't need to show you guys slides for this one. It's pretty goddamn obvious, right? If you have a ton of money, if you have 10 million bucks in the bank and you're a woman of color, you are largely isolated from whatever effects there may be in the world against you as a person in 2023. The money provides you protection and access to power and privilege by its own nature. Oprah Winfrey is a woman of color. I don't think anybody's going to say she's disenfranchised and doesn't have access to privilege, right? She's a billionaire. It's a lot of money. Beyonce, Chris Rock, the Obama daughters, right? Barack Obama's daughters, very well educated, protected by the Secret Service, as they grow up, they will have access to all the powerful things. So class to me explains itself, and it needs to be part of this discussion, obviously, right? The fact that it's not is ridiculous. So the second thing is education. And so education, which I'll pull in this slide here for you guys to look at. So education, the data on education is really interesting. When you pull the data and you look, what really becomes clear is that one of the single greatest determinants of income, of your income potential, and the people that make the most money in this country, in America, although I think the data shows the same thing in most of the West, but it's people that have a bachelor's education degree or higher. So there is a strong corollary between your education level and your income possibility, regardless of your race or your gender. So that's really important. And then we have the idea of the 2-parent home. So, and I'll pull up another slide for that. So according to the U.S. Census Bureau, the poverty rate for single parents with children is 37%. So I'm going to say that again. The U.S. Census Bureau says that the poverty rate for single parents with children is 37%. The rate for married couples with children is 7%. So that's a big, big difference, right? 7 times difference, 8 times difference. Huge difference. So having a 1-parent home is a huge liability. So, why am I talking about these things? Well, we need to broaden the discussion. And here's why. I'm going to pick on 3 of the sort of prominent people that are in the DEI space right now and pick on them very intentionally. They're very public figures and they speak about this subject a lot. And so I'm going to call them out here. The first one is Nicole Hannah-Jones. And she wrote the 1619 Project in the New York Times back, I think 2019 or so. And, it was a long article that the premise was that the founding of the United States could be more accurately moved not from 1776, Declaration of Independence, but to 1619, when the United States, the young colony, began first importing Black slaves from Africa. And her contention is that, this was really what allowed the U.S. to become the engine that it became, and that it created this permanent underclass for people of color in this country that continues all the way till the present day. And that was really her contention, and that 1776 wasn't really about freedom from the British, but it was really about this sort of deeper relationship to slavery. So, I would take issue with a number of things there, but the main thing I would take issue with is sort of misreading what the Declaration of Independence and the founding of the United States was all about, which was the first time in world history that a group of white men, for sure, broke from the power structures that be, and they basically broke from the aristocracy, and they broke from this millennia-old idea of inherited wealth and inherited power. For all of human history, commoners were nothing. A commoner, whether you were a man or a woman, it didn't matter. You were always below the aristocratic people that held power. And so what they did, they said, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all white men are created equal. It was revolutionary. And I would argue that that idea, that evolution in consciousness, which is what it was, extended over the next couple hundred years, first to white women, and then eventually in the previous century to people of color, then to women much more deeply through the women's rights movements of the 70s, then to gay and lesbian and bisexual rights, that they have a right, and then now to trans and non-binary folks. And so the idea being that I would argue that the movement that we're talking about here, this DEI movement, is actually an extension of this original promise by the founding fathers that they had the concept, they were able to see that all white men are created equal, but as we've continued to evolve, we've just been extending who's entitled to that privilege to be more and more inclusive. And I think that's great. So Nicole Hannah-Jones, so 1619 Project. So all I would point out about her, she makes a lot of claims about, people like her, women of color, have been denied access to privilege. But I would just point out the obvious, that she had access to the New York Times, which is a really big microphone. That's a lot of power. She had educated middle-class parents. She came from a two-parent home. She was educated at the University of Notre Dame, where she got her bachelor's, and she got her master's from University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Those are very good schools. You meet a lot of people. You get really well connected with things there. She has an estimated net worth of over $3 million, which puts her in the top 6% of the people in the United States. That's privileged. Okay. She's privileged all around. Ibrahim X. Kendi, he's talked a lot about anti-racism. He has some interesting ideas, but I think he takes a lot of them too far. He's a #1 New York Times bestselling author. He got his undergraduate degree from A&M, and he got his master's and his PhD from Temple, great school from Philly. Shout out to Philly, good old West Philly there. Temple's a great school, my former hometown. He had educated middle-class parents, and he came from a two-parent home. He's now the founding director of Boston University's Center for Anti-Racist Research. And in 2022, he made at least $300K in speaking fees alone. That would put him in the top 5% of earners. And lastly, we have Robin DiAngelo, who is white, but she's been talking about this for a long time. And interestingly enough, she came from a working class home, from a single parent home. And as the data would point out, as it would predict, she grew up in poverty and then spent her 20s in poverty, became a single mother herself, which the data would also suggest is highly probable. Had a couple kids, I think. She was a waitress. And what's interesting about Robin DiAngelo is that she denies that her poverty was that bad because she was white, which, she can have whatever opinions she wants about her own childhood. But I would argue that the data does not support that view, that poverty is very bad regardless of your race or your gender. Okay, it's one of the single greatest predictors of you not doing well. So anyway, she got out of that. She went, to my point about education, she went and got A BA, double majored in sociology and history, and then got her PhD from the University of Washington. She's made at least $2 million from book sales, and she makes a staggering $750,000 a year in speaking fees, and all of that puts her in the top 1% of earners. So my critique of these people is that they talk about racism and gender a lot. They talk about systemic racism a lot, but what they never talk about is class, and they never talk about their own net worth, and they never talk about their own access to power. And the three of them have a lot of access to power: journalists, podcasts, company founders, university heads. They're powerful. So if we're going to have a real conversation about privilege, I would say let's have a real conversation about privilege. Okay. Next point for this, and then we'll move on to number 2. So, there's a lot of ink that's been spilled on police killings in the last couple of years. So the data shows that when it comes to cops killing civilians, in 2022, there were 225 Black men who were killed, and there were 389 white men who were killed. But now here's where it gets interesting. So again, we need to talk about class and not just race. In the highest poverty areas, regardless of race, they have a police killing rate of 6.4 per million, 6.4 people per million, while the most affluent areas have a rate of less than 2 people per million. So it's a 3.5 times difference, which is huge, a 3.5 times difference. You have a 3.5 times more probability of getting killed by a cop if you're in a poor neighborhood than if you're in an affluent one, regardless of what your skin color is. When's the last time you heard someone talk about that? That is hugely relevant to the conversation that we're having on policing. And I want to be really careful here. This does not erase the racial discrepancy. There is a racial discrepancy. So whites in the poorest areas, they have a killing rate of 7.9 per million. And Blacks in the poorest areas, they have a police killing rate of 12.3 per million. So that shows that, yeah, there is a racial disparity still. Blacks are getting killed at a higher rate when you control for income. But it's just not the whole conversation, right? So we got to spread out the conversation on privilege. Okay. So limited view of diversity. This is my second deadly sin of DEI. There's a limited view of diversity. So this is going to be interwoven throughout this entire talk, really. But the idea really is that with too much of the DEI movement, it's like they want diversity of skin color, but they don't want diversity of ideas or of thought. So it's like everyone has to think the same thing, but they want everyone to look different. So, to me, this isn't really very diverse. Diversity, to me, it would seem would include diversity of viewpoints as well. Not to the point where you have a Nazi in your group, but you probably could have a conservative in your group, and you could probably stretch yourself to be inclusive of someone who looked at the geopolitical world a little differently than you did. So this is important because higher education is getting more and more stratified. It's getting more and more stratified to the left. And by way of example, so in higher education, the Democrats versus the Republicans. In the STEM fields, there's 4 Democrats to every 1 Republican. That's on balance, but it's not too terrible. But in psychology and philosophy, it's 11 Democrats to every 1 Republican. In the administration, it's 12 to 1. In sociology and in English, it's 27 to 1. And in anthropology, where so much of this work is centered, it is a staggering 42 to 1. That is not diverse. 42 to 1 is exclusively Democrats, exclusively people on the left. And I would imagine if you were an intellectual conservative anthropologist, you might not feel super safe speaking up. Isn't what this is about? So the Foundation for Individual Rights, FIRE, which is sort of like a corollary to the ACLU, but with a much stronger emphasis on the First Amendment, they found that liberal schools forced twice as many disinvitations as conservative schools did. And they found that they created 10 times more disruptions to free speech events like talks than conservative schools. And there was a large study done by the Heterox Academy, and they showed that 64% of the students that they interviewed across the country agreed that the climate on their campus prevents them from saying things they believe. So 64% of students now agree that the climate on their campus prevents them from saying things they believe. That's interesting. That's very interesting. I graduated school a generation ago, and I never felt any pressure to censor myself in any way. So that's really a shame. The second point that I would make here, as some of you know that have watched some of my talks, I have a lot of passion around men's work and helping men in this culture. And I would just ask a simple question around this second critique of a limited view of diversity, which is, why are men excluded from DEI protections or DEI theory? So men are crushed, mutilated, electrocuted, and mangled far more often than women. There are about 5,000 American workers that are killed every year in accidents. 90% of those, 4,400, are men. So I can only imagine if that was reversed, if 90% of workplace deaths were happening to women, I'm sure there would at least be a hashtag around it. I'm sure there would be outrage around it. And I'm sure there would be a push to fix the problem, to figure out what's going on. And it's sad and fascinating to me that the fact that 90% of the people killed on the workforce are men, nobody really gives a shit, doesn't seem like. And yet we're reminded all the time that only 15% of CEOs of the Fortune 500 are women. And we should be reminded. That's important. We need to be talking about that. But we need to expand our view and, maybe look at some of these working class guys towards the bottom end of the socioeconomic ladder that are getting killed on the job. Maybe they deserve some attention as well. The other thing around this point is that boys are getting left behind in education. There's 45,000 fewer boys than girls that graduate high school in 2018. That's staggering. And the repercussions of that are horrible. If we go back to this slide, we can see that, that high school diploma only puts you really in the bottom third of income potential if you just have a high school diploma. It's very sad. And so when we look at this idea that women have been graduating at higher rates than men for the last generation in every field, high school, associates, bachelor's, master's, and doctorate degrees. These are just some slides that sort of show that out. So women are just trouncing men. Some fields, on average, I think the aggregate now is about 57% of graduates from college are women, and that's alarmingly unbalanced. We need to start putting some attention to the fact that men are being left behind. And again, these slides just sort of point that out, how much this is happening. And it's really been happening since the 70s, when we decided collectively as a culture that women were getting left behind, that men were graduating at about 55, 56% out of college, and that was unacceptable because women needed more access to college degrees, which meant more access to privilege. So we just come out of balance a little bit. Okay. Point number three. Point number three is that DEI can be intolerant, ironically. So I like to tell this story because it's so interesting to me. When Trump got elected in 2016, there was this thing called the Million Woman March. I think you guys probably remember that. He got elected. Trump, of course, is somewhat of a misogynist. I think we would all agree. Grab him by the pussy, that famous comment that he had. And so when he was elected, a bunch of women, grassroots, they got together. 1 million women took to the street. It was impressive. It was powerful. It was a demonstration of what happens if women work together against a collective, perceived threat. And it was hugely inspiring. It looked like, wow, look at what's going to happen. This is going to really revolutionize politics and bring life back into the Democratic Party. And holy shit, it's so amazing. And what happened 2 years later, the Million Woman March is kaput. And why is it kaput? It's kaput because they were so goddamn intolerant of each other that they began infighting about, well, women of color wanted to be leading it. Jewish women shouldn't be in charge. White women shouldn't be in charge. Who's more oppressed? Who has more of a right to be leading the organization? And so rather than focusing on their common enemy, they became intolerant of one another, and the whole goddamn thing fell apart. And it's never been built back. There is no Million Woman March, really. And there were lawsuits about who owned it. It was just pathetic. It's pathetic. So if you're in the DEI space and you're intolerant, you need to check yourself. You need to open your goddamn eyes, right? Because something is afoot. So, obviously the DEI movement is intolerant of conservatives and Republicans. They view them as dangerous, right? The DEI space can view ideas as dangerous and speech as dangerous, and those are stupid ideas. Okay, they're stupid fucking ideas. Ideas aren't dangerous. Ideas aren't dangerous. Ideas are just ideas. They get debated. You talk to someone, you debate them publicly, and you demonstrate that their idea is stupid and your idea is better. That's how you combat actual violence. You combat actual violence with speech. So you don't want to repress speech, because then all you allow people have to do is violence. If you don't let them talk, then the only option you give them is violence. So let everybody share their ideas, even the dumb ones that you find scary and threatening. Let the people on the far right talk. They out themselves. You know where they are. Defeat their ideas with your mind, right? We don't have to go and oppress everything. It's very anti-liberal. And it shows that you're not very good at debating and defending your ideas. So, Ibrahim X. Kendi and Robin DiAngelo, we'll get into this a little bit later, but they teach things like silence is violence and white fragility and systemic racism. And really, these are just control mechanisms that prevent debate, that insulate them from criticism, and that make them impervious to evolving their ideas. It's not good. It's intolerant. Let's tell the truth here, right? If I worked for a big tech company, if I was employed by Google, or if I worked for the University of Colorado, or if I was a high school teacher here in town, I would very likely lose my job for having this talk. That is not hyperbolic, and I'm not being reactionary. I think it's a real risk, especially if I work for a big tech company. It's happened quite a bit. Because DEI can be intolerant, ridiculous. There are all kinds of things now. People are afraid to speak up. There's all kinds of evidence about this because they're afraid of being labeled racist or being fired. There are purity tests now. Purity tests the same way that Joseph McCarthy and McCarthyism had purity tests around, are you a communist or are you a patriot, in the 50s. There are purity tests at almost all universities now when you go to get employed or you want to continue your degree, advanced degrees for like PhD programs, even if you're in the STEM fields. What have you done to further DEI initiatives? What have you done to further social justice? This is idea policing. This is you forcing a narrative onto somebody that they, by definition of the way it's asked, cannot criticize. They can't offer a meta-criticism of social justice if the job demands that they answer it in a positive way. It's a trap. Okay. So those are some of the points around the problem of DEI can be intolerant. And I would make, for you integralists out there, I would make a meta argument here, a meta point, which is that, if you think of what DEI has been trying to do is go into some of these unhealthy hierarchies of white men, old boys networks, and said, hey, boy, there's an unhealthy hierarchy of privilege and access to power here for people that look and talk a certain way. And so we're going to come in and we're going to break it up. And that's great. And I agree with that. I think those old boys networks have existed, do exist. I think they should get broken up. I agree. But the trouble is they come in and they put in their own hierarchy where you have to kowtow to those beliefs. And they just put a different group of bullies at the top of the hierarchy and demand subservience to their ideas or else. So in integral terms, what that means is they're replacing one dominator hierarchy with another kind of dominator hierarchy, but they're not actually changing the nature of the domination itself. So it doesn't change anything. It just puts a different bully in charge. Okay, so the fourth point. So the fourth point is an overemphasis on oppression and power. The fourth deadly sin is an overemphasis on oppression and power. So this is one I'm really passionate about, and I'm going to spend some time here. Okay. So the first thing I want to talk about is something that we all know. So, well, you may not know this, but the point I'm going to make should be obvious to everybody. Kenyans from Africa and marathons. So since 1960, Kenyans have been dominating marathon races all over the world. They just simply dominate the sport, which is interesting because the ones that dominate running, they're from a tribe that only makes up about 3% of the population of Kenya. And there's lots of reasons they're finding out. There's a particular thing with their genetics. There's a way that the altitude at which they live. There's a whole cultural way that they are rewarded for, how they run and why they run and all these things. The idea being that Kenyans dominate marathons every year for the last 60 years. And is it because of oppression? Is it because they're gaming the system? Is it because Kenyans have found a way to repress other people and to stack the deck, that this meritocracy, what appears to be a meritocracy, is actually really just a rigged game? And it's a rigged game because the same people keep winning. And if the same people keep winning, these dirty Kenyans, then it must mean oppression is afoot. What other explanation could there be? What other explanation could there possibly be for Kenyans winning marathons? Well, there are lots of reasons: genetics, environmental, cultural. There's lots of reasons that Kenyans win marathons, and oppression is not one of them. So taking that logic, and now we're going to extend it to where we are today. Okay, so I picked up a Scientific America before Christmas this year. I used to love Scientific America. It's one of my favorite magazines. And I was excited because on the cover they had like a woman hunter-gatherer, and I forget the article's title, but it was something like, talking about how there's new research that shows that women may have been doing as much of the hunting with men in pre-modern societies. And I was like, oh, that's fascinating. I'm really curious to read about that, curious what the data shows. The article had no data. The article had no science in it. It was basically an opinion piece. And there was a quote in it from the two women that wrote it that really stood out to me. And the quote was this, again, from Scientific America, December 2023. The inequality between male and female athletes is a result not of biological differences between the sexes, but of biases and how they're treated in sports. Okay, so I'm going to say that one more time. This is in Scientific America. I'm going to say it again. The inequality between male and female athletes is a result not of biological differences between the sexes, but of biases and how they are treated in sports. So what I'm going to tell you is that statement is wrong. There is no partial truth in it. It's flat out wrong. There is no truth in that statement, none. And it seems pretty obvious to me. We look at the Olympics, we look at the NFL, we look at, professional basketball. But just in case it isn't obvious, I just pulled a few slides here. So this is compiled by Duke Law. You can go look on Duke Law's website if you want to see the research and where it's from for yourself. But this is the world's best women versus boys that are under the age of 18. And this is in just about every event: 100 meter, 200, 400 meter, 800 meter, 1500, 3000, 5000, high jump, pole vault, long jump, triple jump. Boys outperform professional women every time. Okay. And that's boys. If we go to this slide, we can see that when the world's best women are competing against the world's best men, the men completely dominate them in those same categories, right? Sometimes by thousands of outperformances, sometimes by hundreds and hundreds of outperformances, but there's no question of the data. And, this is an even more nuanced one, but just showing how many instances of men outperforming women there are, 10,000, 13,000, 12,000, 8,000. So the point of all this is just to say that, and I gave a whole talk about this called What is a Man? That's on Integral Life. Actually, the whole talk is available, so you don't need to be a member to watch it. And in that talk, What is a Man? I really get into this idea of the difference between sex and gender, the bell curve of gender, secondary sex traits, what all this stuff means when it comes to sort of understanding how we're defining men and women. and how to parse apart psychology versus biology versus culture or sociology, and how those three things play together. And it's a really important conversation if you want to understand this stuff. But it is not true that the inequality between male and female athletes is due to oppression, any more than it's true that Kenyans win marathons because of oppression. It's just not true. It's a stupid conclusion, period. Okay. This is a big one. See if I can get through this in a reasonably quick time here. Okay, so the wage gap. Boy, is there a lot of ink and a lot of emotion around the wage gap. So according to payscale.com, which is the main aggregate on the left that pulls the data, that talks a lot about how problematic this is. So I trust their data because they're pushing a viewpoint that I fundamentally disagree with. I'm using their data. So we have two phenomena in the world when it comes to the wage gap. There is the controlled and the uncontrolled gap. The controlled wage gap means that you control for title, education level, hours worked a week. And when you control for those things, architects that have master's degrees that work 65 hours a week, doctors, blah, 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 right? Finance people, healthcare, whatever. When you control for those things and you average all the data together, there basically is no wage gap. It's 99 cents women to $1 to men, which is statistically irrelevant. So that's pretty interesting. So that means inside of professions, when you control for title, education level, and hours worked, on average, there is no wage gap. There is no wage gap. There is an uncontrolled wage gap. That's the 83 cents per dollar that you see right there. So if you take all women and all men that are working and you run the numbers, then women are making 17 cents less than men are for their dollar. And that supposedly is because of oppression, of course. Like Kenyans, how else could you explain this wage gap? It has to be dirty men holding on the power, forcing women into subservience. We got to fight for this. And, all these stories get generated. But the trouble is, what other factors might explain why there's this wage gap? Is it possible that free choice, the free choice of women, could be a factor in it? Like choosing pregnancy and motherhood over career, choosing less insane work hours, choosing professions that pay less but are safer. Remember, 4,400 men die each year at work. Those are all dangerous jobs. Choice of their college major, occupational choices. I'm not saying that there is no sexism. I want to be really clear in that. Okay? I've known a lot of women over my life, and of course there's sexism. Of course there's boys' clubs. Of course there's barriers to growth in some companies. It's worse in some industries like finance. It's not very bad in healthcare. Healthcare is dominated by women. So there's variance between fields, of course. And of course, you can run into some sexist asshole at any company who has an axe to grind with a woman or with women in general. I don't deny that any of that's possible. But we're talking about systemic, right? Not anecdotal, occasional. This is a systemic. And the argument on the left is that what's causing this 17-cent gap is oppression. And they haven't proven their point. The data doesn't back them up. Let me give two examples to explain what I mean by that. So Uber, the car sharing service, they did a big experiment a few years back, and I think it was The Economist that broke down the data, but I could be wrong about that. What they found when they studied men and women, they knew that people were just driving their cars. There's no office, there's no boss, right? So, and they looked at the algorithm. They knew the algorithm wasn't sexist. They weren't giving men more rides than women. And so they thought, let's look at this. And shockingly, they found that there was a 7% pay gap in favor of men. So women were making 93 cents to a man's dollar. Oh my God. Oppression? Well, no, of course not oppression. They found that there were three factors that caused men to make more money. One was how long they've been driving on the platform. I think because they get better choices, like they get better selections. But how long they were driving was an important factor. The preference over where and when they would work. So men would work later and in busier parts of town, deal with more traffic, that kind of thing. And the speed at which they drove. Men drove faster. Like, I forget, like 4% faster or something like that. But enough that when you take that over years and you study, hundreds of thousands of rides, it creates a preference for men, bias for men. So the authors concluded, when they looked at these three things, they said, and this is sort of a bit of a mouthful, but I'll sum it up. They said, this suggests that as the gig economy grows and brings more flexibility in employment, women's relatively high opportunity cost of non-paid work time and gender-based performance differences can perpetuate a gender earnings gap, here we go, even in the absence of discrimination. In other words, the free and open choices of women as drivers results in them making 7% less on the dollar. It's nobody's fault. It's nobody's fault. Okay, so now I'm going to step into a bit of a minefield with this one, but here we go. Let's step into STEM, the STEM fields, because boy, there's a lot of ink spilled on this one too. 20% of STEM is filled with women on average. You go to Google, you go to their developers, right? Most companies, it's about 20% women to 80% men. Men are dominating the field. So why? Well, oppression, of course. Obviously, it's the only explanation. On to the next topic. No, I'm just kidding. So there's an interesting corollary with the data here. Guess what percentage of women graduate in STEM degrees? Take a wild guess. 20%. Guess what percentage of women work in the STEM fields? 20%. Now, I'm not a statistician, but why would you expect that 50% of the jobs in the STEM fields would be held by women if only 20% of the degrees are going to them? I don't think that math works out. I think you would run out of people, I'm pretty sure. I'm pretty sure you could never get equity there. You could never get to 50-50 because there aren't enough women to fill the jobs. So again, I want to acknowledge, right, there's a truth here that can tech bro culture be a problem? Can it be misogynistic in its orientation? Is there a problem if 80% of a company is made up of men who maybe aren't super developed in the emotional line of their development? Yeah, it can be a boys club thing. It can create a toxic culture, possibly, It can make a barrier to the entrance into the field. Those things are all true. These are all things we can talk about. These are all things that are valid criticisms, and they're on the table. But we can't just say the reason there aren't 50% women in STEM is because of oppression, hard stop. You can't say it because the data doesn't support that any more than if you say that the reason Kenyans dominate marathons is because of oppression, hard stop. Sloppy thinking. Okay. So I would also remind you guys that, in some of the Nordic countries where they've done more than any other culture in the world to try to obliterate cultural biases based on gender, of their own free volition, it's something like 19-1 nurses are female to men. It's something like that. It's ridiculously female dominated, and engineering is like almost the reverse. It's like 17 or 18-1. Their STEM fields are dominated by men. And that's because they did the most they could to try to obliterate cultural differences and then not have equity of outcome, which is what we're going to get to next, equality of outcome, but they tried to get to equality of opportunity. So if everybody was given a chance, educated the way they wanted to be, the presumption would be that all the fields would be 50-50. And it turns out that women and men choose things different. They choose different fields in a way that's really statistically significant and may not be about oppression. It may be about the free choices of men and women. We have to be willing to concede that that could be at play here. So I have some slides to sort of point this out. So if we look at this slide and we look at, this is percent enrollment for PhDs in the US. And so if we look at this, what do we see? We see that, all right, in engineering, wow, it's 75% of engineers that are getting PhDs are men, 75%, 3 out of 4. Math and computer science, it's 70%. Physical sciences, 65%, and in business, it's 55%. So this is where all the energy is right now, right? the DEI folks look at this and they say, how do we explain this? 3 guesses. Oppression, oppression, and oppression. That's what's really going on here. That's how they explain that. This is explained by oppression. So what happens then if we broaden our data set out a little bit? Well, now we've included the social and behavioral sciences, the biological and agricultural sciences, the arts and humanities, and other fields. And we see that as we get to all the combination of all other fields that aren't listed on this chart, women are about 51%. If we get people getting their PhDs in arts and humanities, we can see that the female enrollment is over 50%, 50, maybe 3%. The biological and agricultural sciences, about 52 or 53%. And the social and behavioral sciences, their women are about 62% of graduates. So that's sort of interesting. So, it looks like there's a lot more women choosing to get degrees in different things. But then what happens if we really open the chart up all the way? Well, isn't that fascinating? So in the health sciences, women are graduating at the same rate as math and computer sciences that men are graduating, which is about 70%. 70% of people that are getting PhDs in health sciences are women. In education, it's about 68%. Public administration, it's about 65%. And so how come that's not oppression? Why would we look at the top half of this chart and say the reason women are just dominating health sciences, education, public administration, and the social and behavioral sciences, the reason they're dominating it is because of oppression. They must be discriminating against men. It's the only logical explanation why men aren't graduating in those places. Right? No, of course not. Of course, that's not what's happening. What's happening is the free choice of people. Women are choosing to go into those fields, just like men are choosing to go into engineering. It may not be about oppression. Okay. So that is the 5th point. So 2 more points to go. I appreciate your patience, everybody here. 6th point, the 6th deadly sin of DEI. I'm going to call, plain and simple, going to call you out, tribalism. So tribalism, there's a woman named Susan Neiman. She wrote a book called Left is Not Woke. And she's arguing that that wokeism isn't actually liberal, which is, I'm sort of making the same point. But she said that she's found that many, quote, contemporary voices considered to be leftist have abandoned the philosophical ideas that are central to any left-wing standpoint. A confirmation to universalism over tribalism, a firm distinction between justice and power, and a belief in the possibility of progress. And she continues that all these ideas are connected because they begin with a concern for the marginalized people of the world, and they end up by reducing each one to the prism and the prison of their marginalization. It's a great quote. So, right now in our culture, we have an absolutely tribalistic emphasis on race and sex rather than on a universal view of humanity. So it's now considered by a lot of DEI spaces, if I say that I see people as humans first, I'm considered either to be hopelessly naive or overtly racist. The insistence is that I see people only through the lens of their marginalization, which is to me insulting. If I look at some of my close friends and only look at them through the lens of their gender or their race, rather than the entirety of their humanity. There is a whole thing now too going on where if someone says, I don't see color, right? That's now considered kind of like your racist uncle, being hopelessly naive. The idea of a colorblind society is considered something that's not only naive, but overtly racist. And, I understand the argument here. The argument is that if I say as a white person, hey, I don't see color, then my friend who's a person of color will say, well, you have that luxury. You have the luxury of going through the world and not seeing race. I don't have that luxury. I'm on this side of a black face, and I experience how untrue that is all the time. So that statement, while adorable, doesn't really work because that's not the world we live in. And you're actually being a little naive and not very helpful if that's the view that you're taking. It's a perfectly valid counterargument. I mean, it's a perfectly valid counterargument. But to me, we can have both. That my person of color friend can say that to me, and I can say, you know what, you're right. But I'm still going to raise my children with this ideal of a colorblind society. I'm going to raise my children that I want them to view people by the quality of their character, not by the color of their skin, by the content of their soul. Right? I want you to view people as humans first. And then we can talk about and acknowledge privilege. But as we've said, privilege is more than just race, right? If you got 10 million bucks in the bank, you're pretty goddamn privileged no matter what you look like. Okay. So the other problem with this tribalistic mindset and this obsession with race and gender is that where do you think all of this white power, white person, whatever the symbols they're making with their hands and everything else, where do you think this has come from? The people on the left have been obsessing about race. And so they turn around and they're surprised when white people start to think of themselves through the lens of their race. It's like, really? And it gets so silly, right? There's the Proud Boys, right? You guys, for the Americans anyway, they'll know who the Proud Boys are, but this sort of far right organization that was pro-Trump and is doing a lot of protest stuff here in the States. But they were run by a Cuban African guy. And their membership was something like 1/3 not white. And the whole take by the mainstream media was that this was a white supremacist organization. And then finally people were like, well, the leader of them isn't a white guy. And a lot of their senior leadership aren't white people. Like, how is this a white power organization? So the only way that people on the left could explain it, because everything has to be about race, was multiracial whiteness. Which might be my favorite word salad thing that DEI has created, multiracial whiteness. The idea being that because whites have access to all this power, supposedly, other races want to be like white people, and so they take on a multiracial whiteness as part of their indoctrination into the dominant culture of white supremacy. I think I'm getting that right. It's so stupid. It's so fucking stupid. It's like, for one, if you look at a chart like this, you can see Asian people are making what, $23,000 more dollars than white people on average a year. So if you're Asian, the median household income is $101,000. If you're white, it's $77,000. If you're Hispanic, it's $57,000, and if you're black, it's $48,000. So Asians are crushing everybody. And so if this is a white supremacist system, then I would just ask the questions: why are the Asians doing so well? If we're trying to save all the money for ourselves as white people, we're not doing a very good job. That's all I'm saying. So the idea of this multiracial whiteness idea is just stupid. And the tribalism idea, the trouble is people with the DEI thing, they reduce everything to race, but they do it in a really dumb way, because just look at your history. White people are not some monolithic thing. Look at the 20th century, for God's sakes. Look at the Jews and the Germans, they're both white as far as DEI people are concerned, right? You look at the way the Germans looked at race. They looked at, they had these ideas around the perfect race, Aryanism, right? And Hitler was tortured because he believed the British were almost perfectly Aryan. They were just a little less perfect than the Germans. So he didn't want to go to war with them, because in his crazy ideology, looking at everything through the lens of race, he saw that somehow the French were sort of at the very bottom of the list, but the British were at the very top. We have the Irish and the British at each other's throats for hundreds of years. These are white people fighting white people. You have the Basque separatists going against the Spaniards. The idea that history is looked through a lens of black and white is naive and inaccurate, right? It's not that simple. And the other problem you have is that when you force things through this lens, this ridiculous idea of multiracial whiteness, you also ignore all of the huge sacrifices that many whites have made over the 20th century to support the civil rights movement. There were lots of white people that were deeply involved in that, and that's part of progress. They should be celebrated for that. They should be talked about, right? Because we're all in this together. It's the whole point. It's the whole point. Okay, the last point. We've come to the end. So I'll go through this point, and then I'm going to recap, and then we'll open it up for questions. So I see I've got 18 chat messages, so I'll try to get in there and look at those too as the questions come in. All right, home stretch here. So the seventh point, 7 deadly sins of DEI, the final point, seventh point, is that it is anti-liberal. As I said at the top of the call, I am a lifelong liberal, proudly progressive. That has not changed. My politics has not changed. So this idea, this anti-liberal idea of white fragility is very dumb. It's a dumb idea. White fragility is a stupid idea because is there a kernel of truth in it? Sure. I could concede there's a kernel of truth in it, but really what it amounts to in the way it's used, it's just like Freud, Sigmund Freud in the last century. He very hilariously, Freud was of course obsessed with sex. His whole theory of psychological development, everything was reducible to sex and sexual desires. Really, that was it. There was no higher transcendent function for humans. It was all about sex. And so Freud, when people began criticizing his theory as overly obsessed with sex and too narrowly defined for the human experience, he would just simply say, well, that's because you're sexually repressed. So he would just say, my theory explains your criticism in a way that I don't have to engage you with any intellectual honesty whatsoever. And, it's an absurdist argument. It's not an argument. It's a dodge. And so if someone comes to me and they say, well, I think you're being white, it's white fragility. It's like, well, that's not an argument. There isn't a point there. Like, argue the merits of my points. Don't accuse me of something that dismisses my argument so you don't have to step two. Defeat me in the arena of ideas. Okay, so white supremacy, this is also a really stupid idea, accusing all people in one racial category of complicity by nature of their skin color. Boy, if you can't see the irony of that position, that is the very thing it's trying to not be, that is simply a racist policy. To accuse me of wrongdoing, to accuse me of what would it be? Original sin. It's very much like original sin, right? It's like, well, I was born white, so I can't help but be immersed in this culture of whiteness. I'll never get out of it. I'm part of this white supremacist system, unless I'm anti-racist in the way that these people, Ibrahim X. Kendi tells me I have to be. And if I question him at all, then it's because of it's white fragility. So I need to just kowtow and keep my mouth shut because silence is violence. And so not keep my mouth shut, I guess. Actually, I have to be an ally. I have to speak up. Which gets into this whole idea. Silence is violence. Silence is violence. That is a very, very stupid idea. That is a hallmark of a fascist mindset. You have a right not to speak. You have a right not to speak and for it not to mean a goddamn thing. That's your right. You don't want to talk? If you don't call in, if you don't, the people that are on this call, it's not like, well, if you don't call in and say something to me, that's violent. You have to call in, right? That's compelled speech. Silence as violence is not a good idea. So that's another way it's anti-liberal. Other ways that DEI is anti-liberal is trial by public opinion, by having very much a group think, by being close to other viewpoints, being fired for a lack of adherence to a group ideology, which happens all the time, being blacklisted for the same thing. And the only thing I can say about this anti-liberal position of DEI is that it is beginning to turn on itself. I'm beginning to see signs that these purity tests, when this is taken to these ridiculous extremes it gets taken, there is an idea that we have to root out all of the people that aren't just like us in this organization. And it becomes a headhunting thing where, how devoted are you to these ideas? Because God help that you have a different idea. Wouldn't that be horrible? Wouldn't that be violent? And if you believe that ideas are dangerous and words are actual violence, then, which are two of the most anti-liberal things you could possibly believe, if you believe those things, then you're justified in doing just about anything you need to in order to protect people from those terrible words and those dangerous ideas. Okay. So, do a little recap here. Okay. So, the 7 deadly sins of DEI. Number 1, simplistic view of privilege. Number 2, a limited view of diversity. Number 3, intolerance. Number 4, that equality of outcomes leads to racist and sexist policies. Number 5, overemphasis on oppression and power. Number 6, tribalism. And number 7, anti-liberalism. And I just realized that I skipped number 5. I skipped number 5. Equality of outcomes equals racist and sexist policies. Let me fly through this one real quick. So equality of outcomes is a bit of a problem here. Equality of outcomes is this idea that I've been talking about the whole time. Equality of outcomes means that 50% of women have to be engineers. Equality of outcomes means that 20% of people in the symphony have to be people of color. The outcome matters. So it's not equality of opportunity. Equality of opportunity means everybody should get a fair shake at being in the orchestra or being an engineer. Equality of outcome means they have to be there. So I'll just give one quick story, which is that in the 1970s, in a bunch of symphonies across the country, they realized that as the women's rights movement was taking hold, second phase feminism was taking hold in a lot of ways, like great ways. I'm a big proponent and a big fan of second wave feminism. Genuinely. But as that was taking hold, they realized that, hey, all these symphonies are filled with dudes, right? All these people are dudes that are playing in the orchestra. So they came up with this brilliant idea of doing blind auditions. And so the person would come up, they would sit behind a screen, and all of the people that were going to decide if they were good enough to be in the symphony or not would listen. And by that alone, women shot up to almost 50% of representation, in some symphonies more, in the representation, as did Asians. Asians fired up, some symphonies 30%. And it was considered a real win for this idea of equality. Because, that's a meritocracy. Like, hey, we don't know who the person looks like. And boy, you get hired based on how well you do. Our biases can't be at play if we can't see what you look like. So now there's moves in places like in New York City and some other places, there's moves to do this thing of, no, we need to have equality of outcomes, which is we need to say that 20% of the people on the symphony need to look a certain way. And we're going to insist on that. And we're going to actually do DEI hires to get people to be there. I think we could have an honest debate about this. I think we could honestly debate this idea of, okay, what if you come to me and you say, look, the orchestra is almost all white, or is all white. And I'm concerned because I think the reason, Black kids, Black adults, people of color come to the symphony and they don't see anybody here that looks like them. And if we just keep doing blind auditions, we're never going to get representation in the symphony, a Black representation in the symphony, because they're not drawn to. We're caught in a loop here. In other words, okay. So then you say, okay, so maybe we'll allow 20% of the hires to be people of color. But then the idea, if you're talking about equality of outcomes in this way, you have to have a way of measuring progress, and you have to have a way of measuring when it would stop, when it would be over. So in other words, if you do that, maybe you run that experiment for 20 years and you see what changes. Maybe you run it for 30 years and you see what changes. See if representation changes. But you should have a bar by which you say, okay, this is working or it isn't working. And if it's working, we can begin to scale it down and go back to just blind auditions. So, this is how a lot of the affirmative action movements of the 70s and 80s worked. They worked under this overt assumption. We're going to basically put a racist policy in place because we're going to try to get people back up because we believe in this idea of equality of opportunity. But in order to have equality of opportunity, we actually have to rig the equality of outcome for a little while so that we can actually get everybody to the same starting line. But the trouble with equality of opportunities when they don't define their end goal and they're not honest about the fact that they're racist or sexist in their orientation is that they are racist and sexist in their orientation. So you got to tell the truth, and you got to define the criteria by which this ends. At what point have we won this war against oppressive ideology, against oppressive, against the patriarchy? Okay, fight the patriarchy. Okay, how do you know when you've won? By what criteria have we beat the patriarchy, everybody? Does it mean when 70% of people with medical degrees are women, like they are right now? Is that one way that you would say that you've won? How do you define winning? Is it 50% in all the fields? Let's talk about how you define the win. If you don't define how you win, then the war goes on forever, like the war on drugs, right? The stupid war couldn't be won because the definition of winning could never be defined. So if you're trying to smash the patriarchy, good for you. I would challenge you to say, how do you know when it's been smashed? What's the criteria? If you can't define it, you're in an endless battle. Okay. Sorry about that. So let me recap again. Simplistic view of privilege, limited view of diversity, intolerance, equality of outcomes equals racist and sexist policies, an overemphasis on oppression and power, tribalism, anti-liberalism. Those are the 7. Okay. And I think the solutions I've pretty well baked into this, right? In the first one, simplistic view of privilege, we need to broaden our conversations about privilege. In the second one, a limited view of diversity, we need to encourage diverse thought and perspective. In the third one, which is intolerance, we need to create environments where differing opinions are welcomed and valued. Right? That's really important. The fourth one, an overemphasis. We need to adopt a balanced perspective that recognizes that both systemic issues and individual agency and choice both coexist. Right? This is the idea that Kenyans, that women may be choosing not to go into the STEM fields by their own free choice, just like men appear to be not choosing to go into the healthcare fields. So quality of outcome equals racist and sexist policies. A shift there would be providing equal opportunities for all, ensuring that each individual has fair access to resources and chances for success, and creating more than just an equitable environment. All right. Okay, so tribalism, that will be embracing a more holistic view of individuals that includes a wide range of factors beyond race and gender. Leads to a deeper appreciation and understanding of each person's unique journey and characteristics, and recognizes the full complexity of human beings, and enables a more respectful and accurate perception of individual identity. And as far as the anti-liberalism thing, we'll be encouraging a culture of open debate and of the free exchange of ideas, where ideas aren't considered dangerous, and where silence doesn't equal violence, and where proper speech isn't actual violence. You can't have a free and open discussion of ideas if you believe those things. So, and I want to thank Corey DeBose for that last bit. He helped write that up. He has these unbelievable notes. For those of you that are members of Integral Life, it's like he has this whole talk broken down in quadrants and with all these examples. It's really cool. I look forward to everybody seeing it. Whew. Okay. I'm going to take a sip of water. We're going to move to questions. You can look at the bottom of your screen if you want to call in. There's like a call in thing. It'll pull you up. I am going to go through the chats before I take the first call here and see what's in there. Okay. There's a lot of stuff here, but it's all context dependent. So I'm going to go ahead and just suggest that if you sent me a chat, to just go ahead and call in and let's talk about it. So I'm not doing a straw man argument or basically talking to myself. So Michael, Sarah, Frank, a bunch of people have said some really interesting things. Anybody? Bueller? Krista said, she said she's wondering if we each take the unhealed wounds of our childhood and project them onto those identity markers that culture gives us. And I would say, yeah. I've done a lot of work in trauma, and I do see when I look at the some of the DEI energy and the way people are coming in together, I do see collusion around trauma.
Hey, Keith, can you hear me?
I can, Jim. Yeah.
Well, I don't really have a question. I've been following this topic for years, and you've given one of the best presentations I've ever heard about it. And
Well, thank you.
Yeah, you did a terrific job. And I especially, of course, appreciated that you clarified that you see the need for programs that could fall under DEI. You're not denying. You're not
absolutely.
Yeah, you're not someone who denies, who says that racism ended in 1969 with the Civil Rights Act or whatever.
No.
So I really don't have my question, I guess, is what's next for you with this? Are you going to write your own essay for the New York Times, or
I don't have access to that kind of power. I don't know anybody at the New York Times. I mean, I would love to write an essay for the New York Times. I would have to go into their info at New York Times, though. I'm pretty sure they wouldn't select me.
Well, how about the Colorado Sun?
Well, possibly, yeah, I suppose. I mean, my hope is that like Corey DeVos at Integral Life, there, he and I have talked about this, but my hope is just having these conversations. The idea. I hope that if you're a strong proponent of DEI and you're on this call, I hope you felt genuinely included in the conversation. That you didn't feel like I was making a straw man. I certainly wasn't. I was certainly laboring not to make any straw man arguments, and I'm genuinely interested in addressing some of these things so we can do a better job of, building institutions that are genuinely open to all. I'm very passionate about that.
Well, that's what's so special about your presentation. I mean, one of the things is that you are very clear that you see the need, and you're not trying to whitewash, so to speak, the history or the reality of sexism, racism. And that's very rare. You don't, if you to go on YouTube and look for videos about DEI, you'd see more extreme, denial of the reality of racism and sexism, and on videos that have millions of views, or you see more left-wing stuff. So congrats on being.
And Jim, I would actually make one point there. Thank you. I want to make one point before you go. I want to make another point before you go, which addresses that, I think, which is that, one of the things that's being called for is a critique of some of these values, these DEI values, from a place that can appreciate where they are correct and where they're doing real value, where they're doing real good. I would argue that most of the critiques, even from people like, Jordan Peterson, he's actually not really capable of acknowledging where these systemic issues are real and where they're happening. And because he can't see where they're right, all he can see is where they're wrong. And so, in integral language, it would simply mean that the critique would need to come from post-green or an integral point of view rather than an orange or rational point of view. Because it has to transcend but include what DEI can see, and DEI can see more than what the merely rational view can be. So that's a bit of an integral doublespeak for some of you that are on this call. If it doesn't make sense, I apologize, but it'll make sense to the integralists. Good seeing you, Jim. All right, Andrew, you're up.
Hey, buddy, how you doing? I'll just keep this brief. Hey, thanks for taking on a hot topic. I think it's.
I've got my protector here in the background when they store it, so yeah.
That's very, very brave, and I feel a little bit sheepish that there's two white men on the tiles at the moment. But hey, that's all good. I'm kind of just going to pick up Krista's chat comments. I think there's so much truth in that, and if the folks on this call, let's say predominantly centered somewhere around integral, then I sort of think that a thing that's always missing from these sort of dialectics is the view of moral intelligence, and we got to be post modern to even take any form of sensical point of view on this kind of stuff, and because it's moral.
It's a sensical point of view.
Yeah, right. Yeah, in my humble opinion, because and one of the beautiful things of Ken's, let's say, earlier stage work, the 4 quadrants, it's very beautiful, but we're not going to solve this problem from the 4 quadrants, as you said. It's not going to happen. And so, I'm reminded of Alan Watts's, there's no question here, really. I'm just riffing with you, if that's okay.
Yeah, go for it, man.
I'm reminded of Alan Watts' quote, which I'll probably completely bastardize, but, it's kind of, he says something to the effect of, kindly join me up this tree, as he pulls the fish out of the water and puts it up the tree. And so all of these arguments tend to imply that, everyone else thinks that something else is better for everyone else. And that's just bullshit. And so,
well, it's also that's very first tier, right? That the whole idea is we all presume we have the right answer until we can see that our ideas are nested in a hierarchy of development, and then we get a little more humble.
Right, and then if we switch our view as to being totally post-moral and we go with a humanistic perspective, then we just realise with empathy and compassion where everyone's coming from in their point of view on the debate. And so the white man that equally wants to be a CEO as the white woman or the black woman or whoever, they have the right to have the best life possible. And so it's actually violence to try and take that away from an individual.
Sure.
And so,
that's really the danger of the equality of outcomes is that can be.
Well, it's the danger but it's the danger with all of it, because all of it's a big matrix where if you optimize for one locality in the matrix, you're going to disoptimize another locality in the rest of the matrix. Yeah. And so the only way is to get off the matrix altogether. Now, sorry for being slightly, absolutistic here, but it's kind of, you can't optimize the whole system in this way that we're having the discussion around DEI would be my, main contribution to this dialectic. And Alan Watts I find to be quite instructive on some of these sort of things.
Yeah, for sure. Well, for sure. You can certainly take a more Buddhist or absolute view in any of these things, right? For sure.
Right. And
but we have to do that while keeping our heart open to the problem and the care and the need for action while not being attached to the result. And as you said, being open to the fact that everybody's doing their best and they all very passionately believe in what they're doing. And that can be honored without getting drowned in their viewpoint.
Yeah, and so I wonder if we were to, and this is quite utopic, right? So I don't believe this is available to us as a humanity at the moment. I do believe these dialogues on DEI, however difficult they are absolutely fundamentally essential for the progression of humanity. So whatever we like, whatever side we're taking or not side we're taking, they're fundamental for humanity. But I also don't think the solution is going to come socially. And I think the solution is going to come from individuals taking responsibility for their own childhood wounds and their own shadows. And actually taking responsibility, because there's so much under responsibility happening in these dialogues, it's not funny.
Or even a lack of awareness that there is trauma, right? It's like, why am I so upset at this person and this culture? And, that's true on the right and the left, right? It's like, it's because you haven't looked at your wounding, right? And you're just projecting your wounds, your trauma all over the world, right?
Anyway, thank you for the opportunity to, jump on and listen to everyone. And thanks, everyone.
Yeah, Andrew, thanks for sharing, man. I appreciate it. Yeah, it's good hearing your voice. Thank you. And, I would also just say for the integralists that are on this call, that, this could all be looked at through an integral lens, obviously, that, all these things that are happening culturally speaking can be looked at, both through a lens of the quadrants and through a developmental lens and a lens of topology, as Corey's pointed out. But that would have made this call 4 hours long. And so, it seems like there's a lot of interest in this. So one of the things that I might do and offer is to use this conversation that we've had today as like a base, as an anchor, and build on this and, talk about what can we do proactively to address these 7 sins, as I call them, that have to do with moving beyond DEI while keeping a lot of its observations and criticisms of the dominant culture in place. And how do we do that as integralists, especially in a place like Integral Life? What privilege does this view, this developmental view that we have as integralists afford us? What does it make more obvious, and how does it allow us to be more helpful in conversations like this, to be part of the solution rather than part of the polarization and the problem? So that may be something that I'll be wading into in the next, few months over the winter and spring here in the Northern Hemisphere. Anyway, everybody, I really appreciate you coming out and listening today. You can reach me at keithmartinsmith.com. So you can contact me through my website. And happy to take some of these conversations, or if you have ideas or thoughts. It's just an honor, and it was a privilege to be able to share these ideas and thoughts with you today. And I hope they're helpful. I hope this is part of a conversation that we can have more often. And like I said, I'm sure that I screwed up parts of this talk. I'm sure I have biases in place. I'm sure that I made errors in thought and logic. I'm sure. To me, it's part of being human. I'm not up here trying to be right. I'm up here trying to be helpful. So I would sort of end on that note. So, okay, everybody. Thank you so much. It's no fun to do if nobody's here. Otherwise, I'm just talking to myself. So thank you again for your attention. See you next time.